Guys, welcome to another edition of the Longevity Wisdom Podcast. We have Patrick Seebold with us. He is Ph.D. In human factors and applied cognitions, completing his Ph.D. currently. He's also a fellow at Longevity Biotech Fellowship, and we're going to talk about longevity, psychology, and everything in between. Pat, welcome to the pod. Can you tell us a bit more about yourself? Give us a brief introduction.
Sure thing. Thanks for the introduction, Charles. Glad to be here. So yeah, I am currently pursuing my PhD over at North Carolina State University, where I'm doing some work with neuromodulation to understand kind of the relationship between the brain and behavior. Also a fellow at the Longevity Biotech Fellowship. So yeah, I'm really interested in the entire space of health span, lifespan medicine, and generally just human enhancement and restoration work in general.
Pretty cool. So tell us about the thesis that you're currently building. Tell us about the interest in the world of longevity, the trends, and what are your predictions in the next 5 to 10 years? Because we've seen David Sinclair make pretty bold predictions and other thought leaders in the field. Tell us about what you're doing and what the future will look like, hopefully.
Sure. Yeah. So my work currently, the research I'm doing isn't directly related to the longevity work. I kind of have these two thrusts where I'm doing the true neuro work, neuromodulation type things, and then also the longevity in addition to that. So in the lab, my current work that I'm just wrapping up was using transcranial
That electricity
Hello.
was lost and we're back. So you were saying that what you were currently working on, we lost you at that moment. Actually, I lost you. Tell us a bit more about that and your future predictions on longevity.
Sure thing, not a worry. So yeah, my current work, just wrapping up some projects working with transcranial magnetic stimulation. So using non-invasive methods of activating the brain from the outside to kind of get an understanding for how things are working in there. Just wrapping up some experimentation, looking at how different sensory conditions influence the visual circuit. So does it depend what kind of atmosphere you're in terms of sound to see how that part of the brain is actually going to be functioning. Just wrapping that up currently. About to start some new stuff in that general vein. A bit too early to speak directly to what it's going to look like, but got some cool ideas coming, I hope. On the longevity side of things, I find it tricky to get I'm not comfortable making a hardcore prediction, like saying at this point we're going to achieve this marker or whatnot. But I'm probably on the more optimistic side about seeing changes and kind of progress in our lifetime, just drawing on inspiration from the way I like to think of it is, yes, you use like David Sinclair's work, really, really interesting epigenetic reprogramming work going there. And just recently they had their announcement about the research in non-human primates, which is very exciting. But the way I like to think of it is, I'm not really an AI person. Like I don't spend a lot of time in that world. I've been getting more acquainted with it since the emergence of ChatGPT and such. But I like to kind of compare the fact that 6 months ago, I was completely unaware of ChatGPT, never heard of the thing, and now it's completely here. And it's the entire conversation of what would we be doing if we had these kind of tools have shifted now that we have that kind of a tool. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point, like right now, my projections, I think we're kind of on this trajectory of slow progress toward the longevity solutions, like finding slow ways to understand what's happening in the body and how we can change it. But I have a lot of most interesting changes I've seen in the scientific landscape come in these kind of unexpected, oh, okay, I didn't expect this today. It just has kind of popped up. So I imagine we're probably a ways out. I don't think it's going to be in the next few months, maybe even years, that somebody's going to come and say, hey, I cracked the code. Here's what we need to be doing. But I wouldn't be surprised if we have a series of kind of unexpected, oh, wow, we can actually do that. Oh, wow, we can actually do that. That starts to accumulate and then start pushing us in a good direction, hopefully pretty soon.
Right. I think if we're trying to rebuild an intelligence, which is the tool we've been using to build all these discoveries, So there's neuroscience and there's kind of the intersection of computer science, and merging both seems to have exponential results in all fields, from physics to longevity to biochemistry. And that's pretty much crazy, flabbergasting, super interesting. And I do think that it's going to have major effects in all sciences in the next 5 to 10 years. Like, if I'd have to be bold, I think we're gonna crack eternal lifespan in less than 10 years. And that depends mostly on how the progress of AI companies, and I'm 80% sure of that. So there's still the remaining 20%. But yeah, like, and that's why, I kind of cringe when I see the open letter, with the stopping the AI stuff. I think polls that I wrote, which was very extreme, but it's always interesting to observe interesting extreme philosophies of yours, very leftist, but was, okay, let's stop AI for 6 months and kill, I think it was 12 million people, because that's how many people die per day of all kinds of disease. And obviously that's extreme because that doesn't exist yet, but that would kind of be the effect if you calculate that this is time lost and a full halt, which would obviously never happen, right? But I think that a very extreme philosophy, which is, oh, let's stop the 6 months, needs to kind of be balanced out by the complete opposite, which I think can bring some reasoning in between. But yeah, I think if anything's gonna crack, it's obviously it's AI and the powerful minds of many scientists put together in one room. I think what OpenAI did together was quite amazing. And obviously there was the capitalist side of things with Sam Altman that was very agile. That's obviously needed, resources and money and energy, and all of these beautiful things put together. What were your thoughts on this open letter, if you want, and what are your thoughts on OpenAI and how to pack up a team of talented scientists and make amazing stuff happen?
Right. Yeah. So I tend to think of things in the kind of like putting the letter in kind of terms of human behavior in general. We have a whole bunch of people doing a whole bunch of different things, all pursuing their own agendas. I tend to think of this in kind of a statistical sense, which is, again, part of my training, just approaching human behavior with statistics and such. But it's imagining, like, if you're asking 100,000 people their opinions on AI, and you're going to end up with this lovely normal distribution on average, where there's going to be, on average, someone's going to be like, okay, maybe not. Like, if we say there's a score of 5 on a scale of 1 to 10 or something, probably on the one extreme, you have okay, we need to stop it completely. We can't continue on this. This is going to be terrible if we let this AI stuff go. And that would be a pretty extreme response. Then it sounds like, on the other hand, we've got kind of I didn't see your response to it, but it sounds like your kind of response is, no, screw that. We need to keep going full speed ahead. There's too much to miss from it.
Maybe not full speed, because that would also meet my conclusion. I mean, first, I am less well versed than most opinions out there. I still think I have a valuable opinion, because I have dead angles that people don't see usually from talking to so many folks. But it's less extreme than it was before. It's like, let's go, but with some moderation. I had the dude on my podcast, an OpenAI dude, and he was 80% sure that AI was gonna destroy humanity in less than 30 years. And he's like, he has a track record with predictions. And yeah, he's in the field. So that was kind of scary. I don't think that's gonna happen. And who am I to make these predictions? But that kind of changed my opinion. And that's the value of having other opinions, is that it's never like 100% and 0%, right? It's probably in the 80% zone at some point, 60. It's more grayish, and that's why I love talking about people with different opinions, so that I can change. Obviously, it's painful once you listen to someone, and your emotions, they kind of wrestle with one another, but eventually you sleep on it and you're like, okay, yeah, he has a point.
Right, definitely. Yeah, I think I respect what you do here, but just bringing in so many people to talk with, because I think that's really just a good thing for science in general, for having a good formed opinion. Is, again, if you ask 100,000 people, you're going to get 100,000 different ideas towards something. It might be that you start seeing these emerging trends, and it can be very powerful when you start seeing that, depending on what somebody is familiar with, where they've trained, what they're currently working on. You can start finding patterns there. Okay, the people more familiar with this technology tend to think this, versus people over here tend to think this. It can be very useful. That's actually a project I was involved with in the Longevity Biotech Fellowship. We were doing a kind of a survey of the longevity field, asking people about the bottlenecks to their progress. For example, like if I imagine you were working in the longevity space and come to you with a survey asking, hey, what is your biggest pain point? What is currently holding you back from having the maximum impact you could have? We're currently still in the data analysis stage there, so I don't have any great revelations to reveal from that yet, but it's a very fun project looking for that. I'm especially curious to see, it's like, okay, are we going to see the people that have been working on this for 20 years? Are they going to have very different opinions than the people who are fresh in the past 3 to 5? It'll be interesting to see that, hopefully give some useful insights.
Right. I've kind of been a bit too opposed to democracy some time ago because I was like, why should we listen to this guy that has zero experience? But I got to respect democracy a bit more with neural nets and the quantity of things. I do think there's wisdom in there in the end. And maybe like when we talk about politics, it's not the goal of this podcast, but I still think that democracy needs to be rebuilt, or the voting system. I think it's really the voting system that is the problem. And just to segue on that, because not the most interesting of topic, but in science, sometimes I believe that the whole scientific method should kind of be rebuilt to get new insights, or at least the way we conduct clinical trials. I do think that in silico trials have a lot of potential, and the way we target people, because sometimes it's like too few people and it's too biased, but it's also like testing the whole population also induces some bias. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you feel there's any value or interesting points in what I just mentioned?
Oh yeah, definitely. I know in the US, the FDA recently just ruled back the requirement for in animal models. I know there's been a lot of, or for FDA to get FDA approval, and I know there's been a lot of discussion on that of like, well, what are the alternatives? If we can start doing a lot more stuff in silico, that would be very powerful. One, just for the speed of iteration, where if you could do some kind of predictive modeling to say, it's like, oh, if I add this drug to this mouse, it's going to do this, and then hopefully scale that up to the point of a person. That's one project I don't have the skill set to be working on, unfortunately, at this moment, but I'd love to see happening. Of kind of, again, just in terms of great moonshot efforts, imagining a mapping of the human body where you could understand just, okay, this person's going to respond differently to this drug, but this person, can we get a prediction of what that's going to look like?
Right.
Closer to my current like study realm, I know that like precision psychiatry is a kind of emerging area. Basically, the point of like, well, we know that this, for example, antidepressant drug works pretty well in 20%. I'm not totally familiar with the percent of people that these drugs work in, but imagine you have a drug that works in 25% of people. Can you find ways before you administer the drug to the person and then have to wait however many months to see the result? Could you find a way of, again, instead of sampling the whole population, could you find the population characteristics of your subpopulation that is going to respond well to it? If you could get that level of individualized medicine, you could probably get a lot of very strong effects, hopefully.
Right. Regarding your topic, because one of the clear revolution and exponential project slash experiment has been AlphaFold. And when we think about in silico, basically it's just giving these computational nodes the same actual weight as in reality, right? Give them the same exact properties. So don't you think in your case that with neuromodulation, for example, you could like really scale the in silico part of things, lead all your tests there because it's so much more scalable. These tests can be done while you're kind of sleeping. Don't you think we're at this level yet? And do you think that could have exponential impact on what you're currently building?
I think in theory, that would be magnificent, especially as after a few years of now doing human subject research, it's messy. And even when you start finding, it's like, oh, look, I found my significant results, our report, our hypotheses are supported or not. It's never as strong as I would like, where you see so much interpersonal variance that it's very challenging to just make this kind of blanket statement about how these things work. if you could do that kind of analysis, if you could find a way to kind of model the brain, model the systems that when you're doing this kind of, instead of actually running the modulation, if you could predict it beforehand to inform how you're going to do the modulation, would be extremely powerful. The challenge again would be, one, it's a lot of work to come up with these sorts of models. The only ones I know we have a couple of, I've read a couple papers that look at like modeling bioelectricity in the brain and how you can how these different layers of the cortex will communicate with each other via these signals. And they're very complex, and they are very, 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 very small compared to the whole size of the brain. A lot of the challenge, I think, in the modeling realm, and again, I'm not a computationalist. I don't do as much work in this space as I would like to. It's just the sheer scale, where if you're looking at literally billions of neurons in the brain, it's a lot to have to actually try to map out, especially when you're talking about kind of big picture stuff that's going to be involving a lot of areas. You're going to have to start, I imagine you're going to have to start black boxing at some point and kind of just look at figure out what the right input output level is going to be to get the answer you're looking for. It'd be amazing if you could do a complete bottom up from the molecule level all the way up to the brain, but that the computation required for that would be insane.
Right. And I'm not sure, like me, I've always been a technologist, so I really think that would be the step one in any sort of project, whether it's pharmacological, whether it's a BCI device, whether it's non-invasive or it is, is it me being naive here? Obviously, I know that it's really hard. Or is it straight up we don't know much about how neurons behave, and it's too complicated, and there's this quantum aspect to it, which is a nice definition to say we don't know. Is it that we're not advanced yet on that field, on calculating how neurons behave, and we can't actually like write the formula, or is it straight up that it's like that? Because I guess it would be AI technology as well, would be, but it's so hard to calculate that, right? How do you actually calculate how a neuron behaves? Can you give us more data on that?
Sure. Yeah. It's, again, I'll caveat by saying I'm not a computational neuroscientist by training. I'm currently kind of dabbling on the side, trying to wrap my head around some of these ideas. My current understanding is that in terms of like modeling a single neuron, we can do a decent job, because when you're talking about kind of communication in the brain, you're really, one of the major things you're talking about is membrane potential. So how you're looking at the neuron membrane, how the electrical potential across that membrane changing, and that's how a lot of the cells are, neurons are communicating. My understanding is that we can do a decent job of modeling that, and we have some fairly basic equations that let us get a pretty decent job of it. And it is really a big challenge, I think, of scale. Again, and that's just my idea. That's my thought from the outside looking in. I'm not as familiar as I would like to be. Kind of adjacent to this, I recently encountered a headline. I saw a headline. I haven't read the paper yet, but there was a recent study that looked at it paired large language models with fMRIs. So it was like they had 3 participants, put them through like 16 hours each of fMRI scanning, so understanding the brain signal associated with different words while they were listening to it, and then trying to remove the words so they're not, the experimenter doesn't know what words coming in, look at the brain state and predict what they're hearing, and apparently could actually do a decent enough job. They didn't get perfect word for word, but could get a general idea. We have these abilities, especially with the AI realm, of being able to kind of match from a large training set, of saying, here's neural data, these are the signatures. We're getting pretty decent at that kind of pattern recognition. The challenge is that we usually need to have 16 hours in an fMRI machine, for example, which is expensive and not super likely to happen, I think.
Well, yeah, even spending 5 minutes in an MRI seems scary to most. I'm tad claustrophobic, not that much, but I guess most humans like to have a way out, right? To me, it's the question I had while listening to you was, do we need to get invasive before we can actually modulate the full patterns and have that kind of algorithm? To me, that's that seems to be the clear path. Or is there a device that can monitor brain activity but without being invasive? Is that MRI?
Right. So we have a few different ways. Like we do have ways of measuring neural activity non-invasively. We have EEG, electroencephalogram. We put a bunch of electrodes on the head and or the scalp, and they're measuring kind of groups. They're looking at voltage changes, but they're really good temporally. Like you can get really good time series data. They're not great for specificity. Like if you have one here and one here, it'll be hard to tell where your signal is coming from in the brain if you're getting big sets of neurons firing. MRI is one very common one, where magnetic resonance imaging. You have things like functional near infrared spectroscopy, FNIRS, which is similar to MRI. You're looking at blood flow in the brain, but you're using light instead of magnets. We have a whole bunch of stuff. The challenge is the number of sensors, like an EEG, which is one of the cheaper options and is still fairly expensive, is much smaller than the number of neurons you're trying to measure. So like, even though you can get decent kind of broad scale pattern recognition, currently we don't have a great way of measuring like single neuron in the living organism. We have a lot of really cool ways of like doing spectroscopy stuff. Once an organism is no longer alive, you can do this kind of expansion stuff and get a really interesting look down at the details. But while it's functioning, we don't have a great way of doing high resolution spatial and temporal analysis together. In terms of invasive stuff, we do have, again, you don't see much of this in humans unless there are in patients already who are having some kind of open brain surgery. We have ways of measuring, like of inserting electrodes to measure potential and stuff. You can do single cell reading in animals and such. The challenge is, again, if you want to do single cell reading of an organism and they have hundreds of thousands, millions, however big or complex your organism is, it's a lot of electrodes and it's very challenging. So I do think you're onto something, where one of the most powerful things that I think a lot of neuroscience could use is better tools of analysis. But I feel like that's kind of true across the board in a lot of science, where if you could enhance the tools that we're using, a lot of very challenging questions could become trivial if you had the right level of analysis, if you were able to get your data with the specificity that you would want.
Right. So I have a bunch of follow-up questions, but the immediate one is, why do you think that is? Is it because scientists are kind of not outdated, but they don't want to use computers? It's like, oh, too complicated, and they're kind of old school. I think the next generation is obviously different, although one could argue that they're mostly good at using TikTok on their phone. So why do you think that is? Because to me, it seems like a low-hanging fruit. Obviously, it's still rocket science. But why do you think that is?
I think part of it is probably just there probably could be some fact where what you're familiar with is what you end up kind of pursuing. I don't think it's a matter where like the current researchers are not good with computers or something, or good with the tech. Like we've seen a lot of very good development happening. I think it's probably partially a question of expense and complexity, and also I have no doubt that we're going to get better tools with time. I'm not sure why it is that there's not a higher emphasis on it. Part of it, I'm sure, could also be the training system, where I'm in the kind of the sciences, not the engineering space. Maybe in the engineering space at the grad level, there's more interest in building new tools and methods. I'm not sure. I don't have a great response to it.
Hypothesis to that is that most computer science majors, they have 150K a year jobs from the get-go, vs the lab that will pay them like 60K or something like that. That could be a good explanation. But yeah, I think there's really space for these hybrids. There's so much value in these hybrids of people that study two science. For example, the founder of DeepMind, he has, I think, a PhD in neuroscience and also in computation. So just a genius, this Dennis Habesis. Yeah, this guy is quite amazing. Then I have a bunch of follow-up questions for you for what we just mentioned. So yeah, AlphaFold, I think, has been the most surprising discovery as of late. But I want to talk like more of what you're into first. Like obviously this is not directly your domain, but any thoughts on Neuralink and the approach that they're taking? Because Musk is certainly a a tech first, computation first type of guy. He's also an engineer, and he reunited one of the most talented folks in one room, just like OpenAI did. What are your thoughts on Neuralink?
Honestly, I'm not as up to date on them as I'd like to be. I saw one of their presentations a few months ago, like their demonstration of the tech. I'm fascinated by it. It's the kind of thing that, like, I'm not familiar with like what the data looks like or how precise the measurements can get. I'm not familiar with what the risk factor is like to the actual neurons that are interacting with this. I'm excited to see where it goes because I feel like they're kind of the oh, I'm blanking on the term, but they're the household name for brain computer interfacing stuff. And I think it's, if nothing else, it's really good just to have that level of talent and funding on the problem, because I think it's one that hasn't received a lot of, it's not as widespread as it could be. And I have a feeling eventually it's going to become very, very powerful. I think one of the other problems I see is we currently don't have any great, to my knowledge, again, this, I might just not be up to date on this, but we don't have any device, any material that plays nice with biological substrates. So if you get an implant and you have it in your brain or your body, it's only going to be able to be in there for so long before the biological system wears down on it and then bad stuff happens. So
and that's a tough problem, right? It's
Mhm.
it's like syncing kind of DNA so that it doesn't reject a bunch of people. They're using big organs, but and yeah, silicon is usually the material. But no, you're right. How would you fix that?
Again, I'm not a material scientist, not an engineer. I like in kind of a similar domain. I love the idea of autologous stem cells. Like if you could use your own biology as a tool to help enhance your restore and enhance the system. I think it would be really interesting if we could find. It's a challenge because I've thought on this for a while, but any of the solutions I come up with, like in terms of like maybe you could encapsulate something or buffer something, it's like, but at some point you always have tech interacting with biological substrate. So it's really that interaction there. And I don't know enough about what actually goes wrong. Like I know I've heard some problems with just like corrosion, I've heard, but I don't know what's actually happening at the chemical level. So I don't have a great solution for it, but it's one of those areas that if we could get a solution, would open a lot of very cool, possibly like long-term solutions, at least in that regard.
What about creating a Futurama slash Star Trek brain and making tests on that brain? Do you think that would actually be possible? An in vitro brain, like a real brain?
Like actually, because a really cool idea. I know there's a lot of work happening in the organoid space, like making neural organoids, like the little tiny ones, to kind of get an idea for it. In terms of actually building a brain, my gut response is, well, why not? What is the limiting factor on this actually happening? In terms of my practical brain, that is, well, okay, what is the actual step? Like, how would you actually do this? I know there's some work happening, like looking at trying to like create artificial neurons and get them working together in that kind of like silicon-based brain and such. I'm not aware of any like kind of research that is looking to construct a human brain, something completely outside of the body, like a full-grown brain. I imagine you'd probably end up with a lot of ethical problems there. And
As well.
Not an expert on the topic, but I feel like it would be one that would get into a lot of gray area.
Yeah, and seems infinitely complex, granted that all of these cells are kind of pre-programmed to do one precise things. There's the nutrient aspect of it, and but I mean that could also be another way. We've gone like quite wide so far. I like it's kind of a brain workout if you want, but I want to talk more about like concrete stuff and use these last couple minutes for that.
Sounds good.
We've seen a lot of non-invasive kind of helmets that modulate brain waves and so forth and induce people in high performance state. That's the claim. Do I believe it? Possibly, you know, like for example, when you listen to white noises or brown noises, or just when you meditate, you get in a different state. So tell us about the short-term possibility of these helmets that, for example, I would wear, and it would make me instantly more productive as a CEO. It could make me more empathetic when I'm listening to someone and less reactive, less aggressive. Tell us about the potential of that.
Right. A really cool space. That's one of the spaces I watch. I watch because I'm very interested in possibly entering it someday. I love the idea of basically saying if you can if you can map something useful in the world behaviorally, if you can find a behavior you're interested in, some kind of something at the macro scale that interests you, if you can understand the neural signatures underlying that, if you can find a way to help induce that neural signature to come out more frequently or on demand to help bring about the behavior. I'm not familiar, I'm not sure if you have specific helmets in mind. I think one of the biggest problems I see currently is that I work in a brain computer interface lab, where I'm starting to play around with EEG stuff, so electroencephalogram. And we use very, very expensive equipment, wet electrodes. So they're like a little electrode that has a gel underneath it to help get a good connection. I haven't played around with any of these kind of like the publicly available neuromodulatory systems, so I can't say for sure, but it's very, very difficult to get a good neural reading, even in a controlled lab environment with very expensive equipment. So one of the biggest concerns I'd have with stuff in that is we need to find a way to be able to, I'll take a step back. I think it's going in the same way that I made the comment where like we can get a decent idea of pattern recognition in the brain, right? We can look and say, oh, this is their bold response from the fMRI. We think these are the words that they're hearing. We can make that kind of assumption. If I wanted to put on a device for me that was going to bring about some certain response in me, like make me more empathic, make me feel more relaxed, I think it's very likely that it would need to be customized for me. It seems with my current understanding, I think it would be very unlikely that I could just kind of have a general device that we pass back and forth and have the same effect happen. With that being said, I think it's very likely that you might need to have a kind of a training set to be like, okay, wear this helmet, go through these things, do these exercises to help the system learn it. And my worry is, I feel like it would be getting that initial training set could be a challenge. So it's very possible. It's possible that there are some companies out there that have solved these issues and have found generalizable enough ways of doing neuromodulation to help relaxation, to help empathy or whatnot. It's tricky because from the scientific side, it's a really finicky tool. So to the point that like having uninsulated wires in your ceiling can throw off your signal on the EEG because of just the magnetic interference.
Right.
So it's crazy complex. Again, I haven't played around with any of them, so I can't offer a good direct answer. That's my instinct.
Right, which is interesting. And I haven't studied these devices in a while. I used to, when I had my nootropic company, I was even more obsessed in the brain than I am right now. I'm kind of coming back into it and following my passion nowadays. Emotive seems to be one of these for consumers. And I'm gonna have, I think, one or two of founders of a similar company on the pod pretty soon. Yeah, it's difficult to kind of calculate, and well, you could get verbal feedback from people, which is obviously biased. How do you feel, and there's the placebo effect that plays like 1,000 because you have this thing that you feel like damn Magneto or something, and you're like, oh, I have superpower now. That's what your brain tells you, and it's kind of different in reality. So yeah, quite difficult. I want to finish up with a couple of questions. If you want to tell us just a bit more about the fellowship, the Longevity Biotech Fellowship. I interviewed a couple of folks from there. What does it imply directly? Like, are you kind of an advisor? Do you get paid for that? Is it like free money, like the Teal Fellowship? Tell us a bit more about it.
Right. So basically, the LBF, the Longevity Biotech Fellowship, is a program that's meant to activate inactive talent, which is basically the idea that we have this emerging scientific field of health span, lifespan, whether it's appropriate to call it emerging, it's emerging in the public eye. There's a long history of kind of the snake oil side of things, of people like, oh, drink my colloidal silver and you'll live forever, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, the whole idea is saying in recent years, we've had a lot of breakthroughs in terms of how we think about aging and how we might be able to start having an actual impact on it from a scientific perspective. The LBF exists to kind of say, here are people who are interested in this space, who aren't currently working on it, but might have the skills or the interest to actually come and make a difference. So it's not a paid program. I'm one of them. I'm a fellow in it, so I am. It's a pay an enrollment fee to get access to a very strong network, to get a very, very detailed lecture series with a lot of the top minds in the field. And then currently we're working to kind of start establishing local chapters around the US to help, again, propagate these ideas, to get more people working on it.
Right. And so you actually paid to be a part, is like the other way around,
Mhm.
which
It's
is
it's a yeah
interesting.
it's a program that you pay an entrance fee. I know they're talking about changing some of the costs, or like I think the local chat. I'm not sure what the financial model is going to be going forward,
Right.
but I'd highly recommend it for people who are really who want to be in that space but don't know how to get there, because it's
Right.
just it's a very direct path to get direct access to a lot of top talent and ideas.
Yeah, which is pretty cool. For example, if well, and they probably have a lot of grants and loans, but in Canada, if you do such a thing, I think you're like 80% finance, and then you can start dropping money on promising founders, which is, yeah, super interesting and grateful that this actually exists. Last question, which I always like to ask on the pod: do you want to live forever?
Yeah, all else equal, I wouldn't say no.
Yeah, why not, right? If you can live happy and
Mm.
still have the same quality of life. Think, like my feedback of folks that I did ask this question and answered me no, most of these folks were unhappy. Well, I think that's my hypothesis. And surprisingly enough, it's a good part. It's a great majority of folks, like they just they don't enjoy life as much. Let's call it that way. And or they're afraid also of the future, right? The Terminator AI and so forth. Do you believe in these theories yourself, that AI that will terminate everything? What are your thoughts on that to close this off?
I've never actually seen Terminator. I'm terrible about watching movies.
It's just a bot,
My,
an evil bot killing everything. It's an
mhm.
AI, it's Skynet.
My general idea, and I tend to be an optimist. I've trained myself to try to keep in that headspace as much as possible. And it seems to me that the biggest risk we have with AI is it doing its job too well, and we didn't think about what we were telling it to do, and then it's a matter of, oh shoot, we want to do something different, but the AI wants to do it. I think it's possible. Like anytime we have a new and emerging technology of any sort, there are going to be people that are going to be scared of it. Rightly so, because
Right.
you don't know what it's going to look like. I think
Right.
with AI, it's possible. Sure, it's possible. I don't think it's going to happen. I think we're at much greater risk from ourselves and our own inability to be great about predicting the future and kind of helping to push it in the way we want it to go. So I guess it's a possibility, but I don't think it's I don't put too much thought into it. I don't worry too much about it.
Right. And yeah, so I lied. It wasn't my last questions. I have one last one, promise. Do you believe there's life out there? Do you believe there's intelligent life? And do you believe that there's life that is advanced enough to observe us and not intervene? Or is this
Mhm.
just a simulation?
I again, this is one of those areas I'm only just kind of getting into. Like I've only recently encountered the Drake equations and such, and my general thought is the more I think on it, the less sense it makes. Because it's just there's so many, it's like why? I hope so. I hope that there's something out there. It could be really interesting to see it. I also think in general that for the sheer like the idea of helping to have people live healthier longer is good. For one, because I think it'll let us get as a society to a more expansive state where we'll be able to answer questions like that much better if and when we're able to have longer, if we can live for longer, be able to learn more in that lifetime, be able to actually start moving about eventually at some point, just maybe move to other planets or whatnot. Who knows that that's going to happen, because the resource sink is immense.
Right.
But I hope so. I hope that there's more out there. At the moment, I haven't seen enough evidence to say for sure that it's like, oh, I'm sure there is. I don't know the statistics well enough to say, oh, I'm X% confident. So I hope so. I don't have a great answer. I know it's not a very satisfying response, but
Well,
I don't have the data.
I guess your hypothesis is just that, like, if there were these things and at the scale of everything, why wouldn't they get in touch with us? It's always hard to answer these questions, also because we lack the scientific knowledge. Well, at this point, it wouldn't even be called science. It would be some other thing out there that is so weird we can't even fathom. But I think generally speaking, we're about to open a portal with AI and create that alien life ourselves, which
Mhm.
is interesting in itself. And then the Fermi paradox, so we're gonna leave that floating in the air. Pat, where can people find out more about you? On LinkedIn, I would guess.
Yeah, LinkedIn's going to be the best one. I don't have a website or anything currently, early career. Hopefully, fingers crossed, soon that'll be changing. But yeah, LinkedIn, Patrick Seebold. My email's there. Send me a message on LinkedIn if you want to talk more. Always happy to talk science, longevity, all that cool stuff.